Hi, and welcome to this live chapter reading from The Fighter, an underground bad boys romance, book 3 by India Kells, and this is presented by Itsy Bitsy Book Bits. Chapter 1. As he slowed from his vigorous trek from the top of the hills back toward the beach, and despite his body being in a world of pain after pushing himself harder than usual, Jonathan Gage decided to force himself into a final sprint toward the shore. The moment he stepped onto the sand, his thigh muscles screamed in agony, but he kept going until he planted both feet deep in the first wave of calm bliss licking the shore. He wanted to do a fist bump into the air, but he was too busy catching his breath and baking under the brutal sun. The water filled his running shoes, but he didn't care. Shoes were replaceable. Ignoring the beachcombers and swimmers invading the area on this fine morning, Gage rolled his shoulders and walked until the refreshing water was up to his knees. Stopping once more, he closed his eyes and let himself fall back, letting his sweating body be cooled by the churning waters. Even though his lungs burned for air, he let himself sink a little. There would always be time to breathe later. His entire body relaxed, his muscles twitching before loosening as he was suspended by the water. He hadn't known he'd feel so at home in the sea until he'd reached this little wind-blown town on the east coast. Far enough away from anything to satisfy his need for solitude, yet close enough to the city to participate in underground fights from time to time. The location couldn't be better. Apart from his self-imposed celibacy, of course, but that was another topic he preferred not to think about while floating in the ocean. Just as Gage was about to push himself up and take a breath, a set of hands gripped him by the ankles and pulled hard. The surprise made him jerk, but he was disoriented and couldn't tell which way was up for a second. Panic surged as he struggled to breathe while fighting off the unknown attacker who was trying to drown him. As soon as the hands released him, he pulled himself upright and life-saving air filled his lungs. His first instinct was to attack. Still dizzy and blinded by the seawater, Gage collided with his attacker with enough force to make him tumble into the water. Finally having the upper hand, he shook his head and swiped his face with the back of his hand to see a blonde woman in a soaked long floral dress in front of him, sputtering as she regained her balance. The daggers in her eyes were sharp enough to have killed him on the spot. Is that how you treat someone trying to save you? Drown them in return? Gage opened his mouth and closed it, thinking over his reply to the surprising statement. Your rescue technique fucking sucks. Since when do you rescue someone who's drowning by pulling them by the ankles? And for your information, I wasn't drowning. The blonde beauty pushed her wet hair away, annoyance and puzzlement on her face. You weren't? I saw you fall backward into the water, and then you didn't come up. What did you expect me to do? And on that, she turned her back and walked to the beach. Her dress clung to her delightful curves and legs, beckoning him to follow. And as if hearing her call, Gage couldn't help but follow. Wait! Gage jogged until he blocked her path. I'm sorry. It's just that I've never been rescued before, and the way you did it made me panic. I already needed air, and not being able to breathe flipped me into attack mode. It had nothing to do with you, it's just the way I'm wired. Up close and personal, he could see the golden hue of her skin and her aqua eyes. Heat balled deep in his gut, but he didn't dare look down, not wanting to bring attention to the fact he was aroused. He reminded himself that he was there for training, sleeping, and fighting. Fucking someone, even an alluring mermaid such as her, wasn't part of the plan, and it was sure to lead to trouble. Been there, done that, and he was tired of it. Attacking someone is your automatic reaction? What are you, a guard dog? Even reminding himself of his rules, Gage was still amused, but made sure to keep his grin to himself. I'm a fighter. The reaction he saw in her eyes at his words was the same one he'd seen many times before, a mix of wonder and fear. It was another reason he needed to steer clear. Thank you for trying to save me. Even though I thought I was going to drown, your intentions were pure and I'm grateful. I'm also sorry about your dress. She relaxed an inch. Don't worry, it's a beach dress. It's seen worse. There was nothing more to say, so Gage stepped back. He felt that single step away in his entire body because it wanted to do the exact opposite. Fucking traitor. If not for the change in him due to what had happened over the last few years, he would have fucked her right then and there on the beach, using her wet dress as a bed. Damn be the onlookers. Remembering that he was working hard to change his priorities, Gage took another step back and nodded. Thank you again. Have a nice day, sweet mermaid. As he jogged away, heading to his car, his body revved and ready to go despite his decision. Gage cursed between his teeth and knew he'd lose that battle when he was alone in the shower. He'd jerk off into oblivion while imagining that gorgeous blonde with her lips wrapped tight against his cock as she sucked him hard. The bass reverberated through his entire body and even filled his lungs, making it challenging to breathe. Oh, how he liked that. Gage stood on the side of the octagon as the crowd roared but ignored it. With a hood over his head, he rolled his shoulders, keeping his body warm and his focus sharp. The warehouse was packed, and he was glad, as the more people attended, the bigger the prize. And he was there for the money all right, but not only for the money. Fighting was the only way to manage the restlessness inside him and control how his raw emotions coiled tight like a viper, ready to strike at any moment. It was the only way he could let the violence flow out of him and still be able to look at his battered face in the mirror. It was the only time he had sympathy for his image. Many fighters came for glory or fortune. Gage came for something more priceless. His sanity. There was still one fight before his. He'd come early, hoping the atmosphere and intensity would help to get him in the right frame of mind for his combat. For the first time, he felt distracted, and that didn't bode well. Worse, it irritated him to no end. The blonde woman from the beach annoyingly filled his mind, almost making him curse. He'd had his share of pussy and cock, for that matter, and even though it was true it had been a while since he'd fucked someone, this sudden obsession was ridiculous. He almost felt like a child in a candy shop who'd been told no. It was all he could think about. But he wasn't a child, and he knew that if he plundered that pussy, it wouldn't necessarily stop the itch. His sex drive had always been strong, even more so when he discovered that he was attracted to both sexes. What he craved most was the connection of bodies, the taste of sweaty skin, the moans of his lovers when he discovered their weaknesses and exploited them to oblivion. He fucked like he fought, without mercy, until there was one victor. Then he left with a grin on his face and his heart racing for his next potential opponent. There would always be another opponent, another lover, as there wasn't a happily ever after for a man like him. Twice he'd allowed himself to hope for more, and he'd been disappointed. He'd understood then that it was too dangerous to form attachments, and something about the blonde mermaid made him believe he wouldn't be satisfied with having her only once. And danger lay in more than once. Or maybe he was having one of his senseless fantasies. Leaning against the far wall by the changing room door, he observed the fight for a while, analyzing and dissecting it until a familiar voice carried to his ears. He didn't turn or react, keeping his head low and his face concealed, knowing he wouldn't be able to hide his surprise. "This is completely insane. You do know that, right?" Gage froze, recognizing his siren's voice, even after speaking briefly to her. What were the odds of seeing her there? "Insane or not, there's no other choice. I need the money to pay the rent. If I fail, we're going to be sleeping in my car, and you don't want that." Gage couldn't help but angle his head and look to where the male voice came from. His heart pumping, he realized the couple was less than 6 feet away from him. The siren had her hand on the man's shoulder, making Gage snarl. "What makes you think you can jump into a ring and win a fight, Ten? You have no experience." The man she'd called Ten was built more like a lean, muscular swimmer than a fighter. It could help him depending on his opponent, or it would be the reason for his defeat. And if he didn't have sufficient experience, the fight would be a bloody disaster. Too bad, because the man was stirring Gage's curiosity. Yearning for a man was different from a woman, but being drawn to both in the same time frame was a novelty for him. "Juliet, I've made my decision. You can leave and let me fight, or stay and watch. Those are the only choices you have." Juliet. Gage loved the sound of it. It flowed in his mind, and it was almost irresistible not to test it on his tongue. Nevertheless, it wasn't clear if she was spoken for. Immediately, he gave himself a mental slap. Taken or not, he wasn't going to play Romeo, not when his cock throbbed like this. Despite his resolution, he looked at the man heading for the cage. With jet black hair, he could see he was of Asian descent, which explained his physique. But was he a fighter? That was about to be proven when Ten Okamura's name boomed over the speaker as he was called into the cage. Gage exhaled when he saw his opponent. Gage had fought Larry Merkel a few times before. The man wasn't tactical or skilled, but he had the strength of an ox. The man plowed into his opponents and wasn't easily defeated. It took strategy and endurance to bring him down, and Gage wondered if the newbie had any of that. Juliet stayed close to the fence, twisting her fingers in apparent anguish. It seemed that she was Ten's only support, and that alone was a catastrophe for a newbie. As Gage had expected, as soon as the buzzer rang, Merkel charged. Ten was fit and agile, thank God, but he wouldn't be able to evade him for long. At least when he punched the fighting bull, there was power behind it, another point in his favor to prevent the impending loss. Although this wasn't a death match, it wasn't fair. The weight difference only made the battle more challenging and crueler. The first real hit from Merkel got Ten on his side, and Gage couldn't help but wince. Juliet cried out, but thanks to the explosion of noise from the crowd, her support was drowned out. If he didn't up his game and stop exposing vulnerable parts of his anatomy, Ten wouldn't live through the second round. Gage checked the timer and hesitated only a second. Then he grabbed his kit and passed Juliet to reach Ten as he sat. He knelt before him, and while there was blood, his dark eyes were still clear and alert. "Who are you?" Juliet moved behind the fence and gasped when she looked at his face. Gage sighed. "No time for that. Listen to me carefully if you want to survive this fight and maybe win it, and that's a big fucking maybe." Using every second of the break, Gage dabbed Ten's cheek and temple with a coagulant before smearing petroleum jelly to prevent further damage. While he worked, Gage explained how he could get to Merkel and what positions and stances to avoid. Ten needed to be faster and more precise in his attack and not offer him any opening to hurt him. Ten seemed to take everything in and understand what he was telling him and nodded. Too soon, the buzzer sounded and the fight was on again. When he got out of the cage, Juliet gripped his forearm. "What are you doing here?" Was she for real? He leaned toward her and hissed, "What are you doing here? Your boyfriend is about to get gutted out there." Gage saw her flinch but didn't move. "It was his idea. Does he have any fighting experience?" When she turned them to the cage, the fear in her eyes revealed a lot. "He's boxed and wrestled in college. He's fit, but he's never done this sort of thing. It's stupid, I know, but I couldn't stop him." From what Gage could see, Ten was holding his own more steadily than before and had enough brain cells to take advantage of his suggestions, but it didn't mean he was out of danger. Not yet. "I didn't think you fought in seedy fights like this." It was tempting to look at her to get lost in her presence, but he wasn't a poacher, not when her boyfriend was being turned into tenderized meat in the octagon. "Those seedy fights are where the money is, but I'm not here for that. I'm next in there." From the corner of his eye, he could see her ruby lips open and close, keeping her next question to herself. Ten gave a few hard punches on Merkel's side and a good hook that made the ox sway a little. The buzzer rang, and once more Gage entered the ring. Sweat poured from Ten, and he could see exertion taking over. Again, Gage treated his cuts, but mostly told him what to watch out for and how to continue his attack to bring Merkel to his knees. If there was a possibility of that. There were still 4 rounds to go, but Gage knew the younger man wouldn't get through all of them, so he needed to end it quickly. Just as the buzzer rang, Gage leaned closer and whispered something to him. He'd observed Ten's power kicks, and therein lay the possibility to end the fight in the 3rd round. Ten blinked, clearly surprised by his suggestions. Gage turned before he could answer and left the ring. Immediately, Juliet was by his side. "What did you tell him?" This time he turned and hesitated. There was an innocence in her, in both of them for that matter, and he was already tainting it by the kind of man he was. With regret, Gage turned to see Ten swivel and break Merkel's knee in the most sickening sight he'd seen. The crowd exploded in cheers as the giant collapsed. Ten threw up, and Juliet looked away as Gage shook his head in defeat.